It's good to be with you again. It seemed in 1963, 1964, 1965 that we were on a straight road to resolving the issues of civil rights and racism in America. In 1963, we had this marvelous March on Washington and those wonderful words of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. On the balcony of the Lincoln Memorial. And in 1964, with President Lyndon B. Johnson leading, we passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ended racial segregation in public accommodations. And the culmination of that movement occurred the following year in 1965 when Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, guaranteeing the right to vote for all eligible voters, regardless of race. However, things did not turn out so simply, as we will see. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, as we noted last time, generated a tremendous response from Black Americans, particularly in the American South, in the Deep South, states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Now, those states were not anxious to register Black voters because Black people represented as in certain areas as many as 50% of the total voting population. Now here you see a queue of Black registrants lining up to register to vote in Alabama after the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The Johnson administration had to send down federal registrars because the states refused to register these voters. So he sent federal registrars down to insist on compliance with the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now, the 1965 Voting Rights Act likely changed the political landscape of America for all time. We had a Democratic administration headed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. We had a Democratic Congress. And historically, Black Americans had voted for the Republican Party because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican and he had freed the slaves. But this had begun to change, as we have noted, during the Depression years of the 1930s and the administration of the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt. But this trickle into the Democratic Party became a rush in the 1960s as the Democrats stood up for civil rights. And for the first time since the American Civil War in the 1860s, white Southerners began to leave the Democratic Party in significant numbers to join the Republican Party, as evidenced, as we noted last time, by the presidential candidacy of Barry Goldwater, conservative Republican, who had opposed the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So what we began to witness in the late 1960s was really the transformation of American politics, a transformation generated primarily by race. And here you can see the difference. in the South. In 1960, now this was 1960, of course, was before the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. You can see, for example, in Mississippi, as we noted last time, about 5% of blacks were eligible to vote. But by 1971, after the Voting Rights Act had been in effect for 6 years, you can see that number shot up to 59%, even higher in cities, in states like Arkansas, 81%, Tennessee, 66%. And this was true throughout the South, and in my state of North Carolina, 44% by 1971. And this changed the political landscape, as I mentioned, not only in the South, but nationally as well. Now, Martin Luther King Jr., as you can see here, when I show this slide to my classes, they said, "Oh, is he marching in Alabama again, or is he in Mississippi?" No, no, he is in Chicago, Illinois, way up north. Well, once public accommodations had been resolved with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and once voting privileges had been resolved with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Martin Luther King Jr. understood that racism was not only something for the American South, but racism was a national problem. So he went up to Chicago and started demonstrations for integrated housing because Chicago was the most segregated city in America, not in the South, but in the upper Midwest. And by the way, today, 2024, Chicago is still the most residentially segregated city in America. So Martin Luther King Jr. marched in the streets of Chicago in 1966, advocating for fair housing, advocating for the right of Black Americans to live wherever they chose to live. And you can see him attacked by white Chicagoans here with no police intervention. And the other aspect of Martin Luther King's protest was the Vietnam War. So not only was Dr. King, as you can see here, challenging racial segregation and prejudice in the North, he was also challenging the policies of the federal government with respect to the Vietnam War, because he argued it was Black bodies that went over to fight and were being killed. And that was not fair. In fact, it was not fair to America. And again, you can see that the anti war march here was integrated. Here's Dr. Benjamin Spock, the famous doctor of children, Joan Baez, the famous singer. But there were whites and blacks who were opposed to the Vietnam War. And what was happening in the mid 1960s, slowly but surely, America was coming apart. Coming apart not only because of race, but coming apart also because of the war. And coming of age in the mid 1960s was this whole cohort of baby boomers. And we were not behind the administration as far as the war was concerned. We had supported civil rights. And what happened was in 1967, we decided in Washington, D.C., we decided to march on the Pentagon, where the Defense Department was located. And as you can see here, this is me in October of 1967, marching on the Pentagon, opposed to the Vietnam War, opposed to racism, opposed to government policies that gave billions for defense, but very little for the people of the United States of America, particularly the people who were impoverished. Now, what was the rest of America saying about this? Well, to be honest with you, by 1967, the picture you just saw, many Americans were fed up with people like me, young people, people in their 20s, college students. I was a college student at the University of Maryland at the time, just outside of Washington, D.C. And you can see the growing disapproval in America, not only of the people who were opposed to the war in Vietnam, but also for the people demonstrating for equal rights for all. Do you approve or disapprove of what the Freedom Riders are doing? Those people who were integrating interstate travel. And again, a majority, 61 to 22%. Do you think sit ins at lunch counters, freedom buses, and other demonstrations will hurt or help the chances of Black people being integrated in the South? Well, most people felt it would hurt, so that should stop. Mass demonstrations are more likely to help or more likely to hurt. Again, opposed. So public opinion was moving in the direction of opposing demonstrations, opposing equal rights, opposing anti-war sentiment. And this reflected the slow parting in American life and politics in the mid and late 1960s, as well as the transformation of American politics, with the Democratic Party becoming increasingly liberal and the Republican Party becoming increasingly conservative. On top of that, our economy was changing, our national economy was changing, and I believe that this had a significant impact on these splits in American society. What was happening was that the manufacturing sector of the economy was going down. It was going down because large corporations were moving their factory operations overseas, to Mexico, to China, to other countries that had cheap labor. And what happened was that historically, the poor and particularly the middle class had participated in national growth. Uh, but By 1980, this began to decline. And by 2014, the most affluent portion of the American population saw the largest income growth. So in 2014, for the first time in American history since the 1920s, the smallest portion of the very wealthy Americans saw the largest income growth, whereas the middle class since 1980 began to decline. Well, the decline actually occurred before 1980. It began in the late 1960s and 1970s, and that contributed to the split in American society. And one person in particular took advantage of this change of moving the South into the column of the Republican Party, this change of opposition to civil rights, this change of opposition to the Vietnam War. And that man was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan came from a small town in Illinois and became a Hollywood movie star. And then in the 1960s, he moved into politics and was elected as governor of California. And through the 1970s, he kept preaching his message: limited government, no civil rights, and the support for private industry and business. In 1980, Ronald Reagan decided he was going to run for the presidency of the United States. And he launched his campaign in Neshoba County, as you can see here, in Neshoba County, Mississippi, in the town of Philadelphia, Mississippi. Okay, well, you have to launch your campaign somewhere. However, that was what we call a dog whistle, meaning I'm going to open my campaign so all the white voters will know that I am on their side. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, in 1964, 16 years earlier from this particular event, 3 civil rights workers came to Neshoba County, came to Philadelphia, Mississippi, to register Black voters, and they were murdered. And 6 weeks after they were murdered, federal agents finally found their bodies. And the murderers were never brought to justice. So by coming to Philadelphia, Mississippi, in Neshoba County, Mississippi, in the deep, deep South, Ronald Reagan was delivering a message. He was saying to white voters, I'm on your side. You vote for me. And here you see the bodies of the civil rights workers that were unearthed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1964 in Philadelphia, Mississippi. So, what happened in 1980 in the presidential election of 1980? Again, red is Republican, blue is Democrat. The incumbent president was Jimmy Carter, who was a Southerner. He was from Georgia, and he was a champion of civil rights. Uh, it may seem odd that somebody from California, like Ronald Reagan, was not a champion of civil rights. But again, race is a national issue. It doesn't belong only to the American South. And as you can see, Ronald Reagan proved extremely popular. He was very photogenic. He was very articulate. He was, after all, an actor. And he won the presidency easily. The, as you can see, Minnesota, that was the home state of the vice presidential candidate. And Georgia, that was the home state of Jimmy Carter, the president. West Virginia, Maryland, and that was about it for the Democratic candidate, Jimmy Carter. Uh, and that really changed American politics. And because it changed American politics toward the more conservative Republican Party, limited government. And let me say one thing about limited government. Government was limited for folks like myself and my neighbors, but government was not limited for the big corporations. They got a windfall. So when you hear people say, well, we're for a limited government, we don't want the government intruding into our affairs, they're really talking about a small segment of the population. But Ronald Reagan proved popular. He proved popular because we were in the midst of inflation. He proved popular because Jimmy Carter supported positive racial policies. So Ronald Reagan became president and set a trend for the next 40 to 45 years. He noted when he was inaugurated in 1981 that the era of big government was over. It's an interesting comment because in 1996, Jimmy Carter, when he was inaugurated for a second term, said the same thing. Not Jimmy Carter, I'm sorry, Bill Clinton, the Democrat, when he was inaugurated in 1996, said the same thing. The era of big government was over. So, what I'm saying is that this philosophy pervaded both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And that had a significant impact for civil rights. However, because of the Voting Rights Act, the number of people of color who were elected into the Congress, particularly the House of Representatives, changed significantly and significantly for the better. As you can see, this map or this chart from the year 2000. By then, again, blue is Democrat, red is Republican. And as you can see, almost all minority groups are Democrats. You had 44 Black representatives, 24 Hispanic, 9 Asian. As far as Republicans are concerned, you had 5 Hispanic, 1 American Indian, and 0 Blacks and Asians. Again, the polarization of American politics is evident in this chart. Now, Ronald Reagan, as I mentioned, preached limited government. And his philosophy was the less government you have, the better. So this cartoon says, see how much better things are without the heavy hand of government. Well, what happened? Air pollution and acid rain, airfares going high, monster takeovers, monopolies, savings and loans institutions collapsing, nuclear plants not being maintained, consumer protection is dead, job safety is dead, water pollution is increasing. That's what happens when you limit government. Now, in 1992, at the Republican National Convention, one of the main speakers was Pat Buchanan, whom you can see here. Pat Buchanan was an advisor to Ronald Reagan. He was also an advisor to Richard Nixon, who was president until he was forced from office or until he resigned in 1974. And Buchanan made a specific plea to American voters at the 1992 Republican National Convention. What he said was that the emphasis of the Democrats on civil rights means that they only care about Black people. They don't care about white working people. So, in addition to the divide over limited government or expansive government, Pat Buchanan injected the issue of race. The Republicans are the party of white people. The Democrats are the party only of Black people. Well, despite this political divide that became evident by the 1980s and grew in the 1990s and the early 2000s, Black Americans did experience progress. They experienced progress primarily because of the major laws that were passed as a result of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So, for example, in education, high school completion, in 1960, the gap between Blacks and whites was 24 points. By 2012, this had narrowed to 7 points. So that's good news. Life expectancy, again, 1960, Blacks had a gap of 7 years. By 2010, 50 years later, that gap had narrowed to 4 years. And again, over a 50-year period, voter turnout. Again, Blacks actually exceeded whites in the 2012 presidential election, which, of course, Barack Obama, a Black Democratic candidate, won. But there were some gaps that were changed little in the 50 years after the civil rights legislation. the poverty line. Well, blacks did improve, but from 23 points to 18 points in 50 years, that's not a significant difference. Home ownership, actually, the home ownership uh, gap was wider in 50 years later. In other words, more whites than blacks own their homes in 2012 than they did years earlier. Where gaps have widened over the 60 years. Household income. Again, black people went down. That is, the gap between whites and blacks went down. Marriage. Again, the gap between whites and blacks increased. And here we have a very key measure of prosperity. What is the difference between the household wealth of whites and blacks? Well, it had grown from 75,000 to almost 85,000. And when we look at the map of the most prejudiced states, what do we see? When I say prejudiced states, I mean what states have the restrictions, the legal restrictions that limit the advance of Black Americans within their borders. And despite the existence of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and despite the existence of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, what do we see where Black Americans have their rights challenged the most? In the American South, in the location of the civil rights movement. Now, when several weeks ago, when we started talking about the civil rights movement after the Second World War and continuing into the 1950s with the Eisenhower administration, and then with the Johnson administration in the 1960s, we saw progress. We saw barriers come down. Well, the barriers did come down, but new ones came up to replace them. And as you can see here, the South is still the problematic region in the United States. Doesn't mean that these barriers don't exist elsewhere, but they're particularly notable in the South. And here, of course, in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is up north. So it's not exclusively in the South, but the South has been much slower to respond to issues of racial equality than other parts of the country. And one of the reasons for this is that the majority of the Black population of America, 58% to be precise, 58% of the country's Black population is in the South. Now, you may be wondering, well, why, if their rights are so circumscribed, if their rights are being threatened, or there are legal barriers to their rights, why do they stay there? They stay here in the South because we have the best economy in America. And if you want to work, if you want a job, this is the place to be. So there are economic issues, but people should not have to make that trade-off between their rights and their pocketbook. Now, um, there are structural problems within black the black community, and part of the reason for the persistent poverty in Black America is the fact that many Blacks live in one parent families. I'm not saying that if you live in a one parent family, you're going to have a terrible future. But if you're poor or struggling, it makes upward mobility that much more difficult. And look at the difference. Children living with one parent uh, by race and Hispanic origin, and these figures are after the 50-year mark of the civil rights movement. All children 24.9, and you see blacks 52.1. That's over half. That's over half. Asians are low. Um, Hispanics are fairly low, and non-Hispanic whites are low. The Asians are the lowest, but um, these are somewhat comparable, except for this. So that is a problem because it tends to perpetuate poverty. The poverty rate by race and ethnicity, and we see it here. Um, Blacks are the highest, followed by Hispanics, and you can see Asians and whites are they're relatively low. And many of these Hispanics are recent arrivals. So even though they're recent arrivals, they're doing better than Black people who have been here for centuries. I had a doctoral student do a study uh, of testing in a county that's near Charlotte, where I live. And in the eighth grade, all eighth graders, students who are about 12 or 13 years old, take a standard state test. And over the past 10 years, Hispanic students have gone significantly beyond Black students, despite the fact that 40% of Hispanic households have Spanish as their primary language. So something is going on. And part of the reason for what is going on is that we have not followed through on the promise of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And you can see here, again, this 50-year period, 1960 to 2010, when we talk about incarceration, who's in jail? And you see it's Black. Uh, when Obama ran for president in 2012, you see here Black voters 93%. Uh, in politics, if you get 93% of anything, it's incredible, absolutely uh, incredible. And part of the problem is that the Democratic Party tends to take Black voters for granted. And that could be dangerous, particularly in this upcoming 2024 presidential election. Now we come to the map of shame. As early as 2010, but certainly by 2013, several states began to pass voter restrictions. Now, according to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, you cannot target black voters. But some states have been creative. For example, uh, in these red states here, these states all require, including my own state of North Carolina, an official photo identification. Well, what's an official photo identification? If I take your photo, that's not official because I'm not an official. An official photo identification is a driver's license. Well, if you're poor and you're black, you may not have a driver's license. So what do? Well, you can get an official ID, identification card, but you have to pay $5 for it. And that can eat into your budget, especially if there's more than one person in the household who is eligible to vote. And again, you can see here that in the South, all of the states have some restrictions, except for South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. But in other states, there are similar restrictions, Pennsylvania, naturally, and states in the, excuse me, in the upper Midwest. And this has accelerated since 2013. And if you cannot vote, you cannot bring into office people who are going to be sensitive to the issues that are important to you. So the objectives of the 1965 Voting Rights Act are being threatened by states that are making it more difficult to register to vote and then to vote. Just let me give you one specific example here in North Carolina. One of the things that blacks like to do when we have what is called early voting, that is, we have an election day, but then we have a few weeks before election day that we allow early voting. What they like to do on Sundays is after they go to church, they get into a bus and they go down to the voting place and they register to vote. Well, my state, North Carolina, we used to have 3 Sundays open for voter registration. Now we've cut it to one. Again, that's not illegal, but it obviously limits the opportunities because black folks work during the week and it's difficult for them to go to register to vote. The other divide in American society that affects racial issues is the divide between rural areas, farm areas, small towns, and big cities. Black people are concentrated primarily in the major cities. But the way state constitutions and state districts are drawn means that cities are underrepresented, and therefore black people are underrepresented. This is the 2020 presidential map uh, for North Carolina. Blue is Democrat, red is Republican. And as you can see here, in the 3 major cities of North Carolina, Charlotte, Greensboro, Raleigh, and the fourth one, Fayetteville, Democrats prevail. In this area, this is a rural area that has a large black population, which is rather unusual. But you can see in the rest of the state, it's red. These are all rural counties, small towns, farms, and they're overwhelmingly Republican. Republican Party, the Republican Party is the party of the small town, of the farm. The Democratic Party is the party of large cities, and that's where a majority of black people live. But, and please keep this in mind, this is not only true in the South. This is true in the North. Here we have Michigan, and Michigan, like North Carolina, is what we call a swing state. That is, it can go Democrat, it can go Republican. There are about 8 or 9 swing states in the country that determine presidential elections. And you can see here in the pattern 2016 presidential election and the 2020 presidential election, you see all this red, all this red. Well, guess what? If you looked at this map and you didn't know anything except that red is Republican, blue is Democrat, you would say, hey, Donald Trump won Michigan in 2020. He was the Republican candidate. No, Joe Biden won Michigan in 2020 because this is the Detroit metropolitan area. And these are the dense suburbs. This is Flint, Michigan, another large city, Grand Rapids, Michigan. So it's in the cities where minority populations, particularly black people, live. But in the rest of the state, and this is true of all states in America, but particularly in the so-called swing states or battleground states, where the population is white and they're Republican. So you can see this here. America, 1968, 2020. I'll let you read the what it says on the cardboard there. Nothing has changed. Of course, as we've shown, lots of things have changed, but there's also been some backsliding. And we need to develop policies to restore both the promise and the reality of what happened in the 1960s with particularly with the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And for that story, tune in on next week. Thank you very much.